UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
Tonight's guest is a really interesting guy. As an historian of UFO belief, the heyday of the so-called flying saucer contactees in the 1950s has always fascinated me. It was a time before extraterrestrial contact accounts had become married to the idea of alien abductions. Instead, a much more optimistic view of UFOs and their occupants was central to much of the belief that grew around the phenomenon. Back then, there was a very popular idea that the occupants of the saucers were almost identical to us, often just more beautiful and spiritually wiser. The first and most famous of the contactees was, of course, George Adamski. While usually dismissed by modern-day UFO believers, Adamski was one of the most important personalities in the flying saucer community for the better part of the 1950s and into the 60s. Since his death in 1965, the George Adamski Foundation, one of the longest-running UFO organizations in the world, has preserved and continued his legacy. First under the directorship of Fred Steckling, and now by Fred's son. So, I am very pleased to introduce to our audience commercial pilot, author, and the director of the George Adamski Foundation, Glenn Steckling. I was only thinking the other day when we were going to do this interview about when I met you back in '99 when I was doing my PhD research. And of course,
Right.
As you know very well, George Adamski has been really pushed to the side by a lot of mainstream UFO believers. And I walked away from meeting you so incredibly impressed. And I've said that to so many people because obviously I'd read Adamski books. I was a UFO historian. I was conscious of his importance in the development of UFO belief. But Adamski and his beliefs had been so denigrated in so much of the literature that I think I'd almost been, subconsciously programmed to expect that whoever represented his legacy was going to be, unimpressive at best and maybe wacky or something even worse. Instead, you came across as very sane, very sensible, very articulate, and all round very together. So again, I'll just say it was a very pleasant surprise when I first met you, Glenn.
Well, it was a pleasure as well, and that's here at the foundation, my late father and mother, they worked very hard in this program and with George, and of course I knew him as a child. And so this is the type of example they set, and this is the type of characteristics that we carry forth in order to bring this subject to some type of logical foundation and background. Right now, as we speak, I'm working on my first new complete book. It's called The UFO Reality, Can Truth Prevail? It will detail the over 50 years of involvement of my family in history and all the, going to the Pentagon and going to NASA and the House of Lords and all these things are being detailed to give people a view of this subject that isn't so horrific or mysterious or sensational. George Adamski's photos and material. I don't know if you have seen the new book by Renee Olson called The George Adamski Story, which is out by blurb.com, in which he requested access to the original Adamski negatives in films. And I granted that, and he went through it literally frame by frame and pixel by pixel and discovered so much more detail and information from those original pictures. One of the photos where George is sitting there next to the car with some of the other witnesses in the sky above him, you can see the mothership and two small scouts, which was not seen originally in just the plain original fast print. And then by using some of the new technology, he was able to enhance some of the photographs, and you can see the figure of the extraterrestrial walking down the canyon. And you can see the scout ship hanging up on the side of the canyon as well. And so And so the information that came out from this book has definitely got the Adamski critics running and complaining, because the amount of technical information over each decade's technology has done nothing more than validate what George had to say. He's the only one in this field. Many have tried to copy him or substitute, but the only one in this field who had such the plethora of hard evidence. And that's what gives the UFO community a little bit of envy and other things as well, because they tried desperately to ignore George, because it doesn't fall within the agenda of basically replicating what the government is trying to misinform the people to begin with. They're just grabbing the ball and running with it, and then adding their own twists and turns and fabrications, and so, the government agencies don't even bother to come out and misdirect and pursue a confusion like they used to, because the UFO community is doing it for them. And that's one of the things that I'm not only talking about in my books, but been for the last few years speaking about wherever I go. I did in, 2018, I went to Sweden and Denmark and Italy, and then in 19 twice to Italy. And there's a great deal more reception, at least for this, I've found, in foreign countries. Here in the U.S., the UFO conventions are basically just a marketing scheme. And I'm sorry to say, but, nothing of any value is coming from it.
I found that interesting about you being, or the legacy of George Adamski perhaps being taken more seriously overseas, because in the lead up to this interview, as I always do, I try to get on top of the latest research I can. So I hit YouTube, which of course wasn't around when I talked to you back in the day. But so many of the videos on YouTube about George Adamski are from European countries, often not in English. And so it seems like he has almost been intentionally ignored here by the UFO community.
Well, yes. In fact, Tony Brunt, who is from New Zealand, and he wrote an article. I can't remember the title. It's something like George Adamski, one of the hardest jobs, or what have you. You can find it by looking up on Google. He basically said the same thing. There is a concerted effort to ostracize anything Adamski. You don't have to do any battles this way. The UFO community has shifted their focus out of the solar system into deep space and far, far away, because then there's nobody there to negate whatever or they say, or to demand proof of what they say. And so George dealt with the conditions in this solar system, and nobody else wants to tackle that, because the disinformation program that comes through the government and NASA tries desperately to convince everybody that we are the only small little tiny speck of this type of species, and aren't we lucky, and so on and so forth. And so over time, more and more science has come out. Dr. Panampura from the Chemical Evolution Laboratory in Maryland wrote a book called The Principles of Life, and he said, when you go to the land somewhere else, don't be surprised if somebody comes up and shakes your hand, because the human genome is the most common construct in the universe. When you dig a little bit deeper, you start to see what is actually the many different tiers or many different levels of the onion that has been out there. A few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's in the book as well that's coming out, I did a symposium with some scientists out in the southwestern United States, and most of these people had retired or had been involved with some of the major government facilities and laboratories, and were highly educated, obviously, and very well versed at what was going on. And this particular doctor, we were at his home, and he had a gathering, and we had a talk and conversation and showed the films. He went out on the balcony, and he says to me, people have no clue at what a phenomenal creation the human form is. He says lobsters don't crawl out of the ocean, and crayfish and Bigfoot and all the reptiles and all this other stuff to suddenly stand up and have the physical capabilities to build computers and microchips, or even to be intellectually and intelligently able to conceive these things. He says people are so confused with their science fiction, which they have come so readily to accept in the place of science fact. And so I have found, and my father, the same thing, he encountered this, that the natural scientists are much more grounded into the reality of how things are versus the hypothetical or political scientists who have agendas and budgets to make and all kinds of people to satiate. And so there's quite a dichotomy between people who know what they're talking about and the rest of them who are theorizing about it.
For those of our listeners who don't know a whole lot about Adamski, because to follow up what we were just saying, he has been ignored in many ways in the modern field. Could you maybe give a brief overview of the man and a history of some of his contacts and encounters?
Sure. In 1936, he had a school of philosophy, and he had been teaching already since 1930 what he would consider to be the universal principles of life, the chemical evolution of life, the construct of life, the many various aspects, and how these processes exist out in space, and the materials rain down on every planet and seed every planet, where basically space is the womb of creation. And so in 1936, one of his students by the name of Mrs. Johnson gave him his first 6-inch telescope. And in 1938, he was featured in the Los Angeles Times with his telescope and describing the project. And then within a few years, he had already taken some photographs of UFO activity over the southern Los Angeles area. But he sent them into the government, and we had, of course, in 1941 went into World War II. And so all attention and all resources were focused on this global conflict. And so he eventually moved up into the basin below Mount Palomar in 47 and established, actually, Alice Wells, one of his students, bought the property, and they went ahead and built it up in cabins, and Mrs. Wells put up a little restaurant for the astronomers and the construction people who, in that year, were putting together the Hale Observatory, the 200-inch up atop of Mount Palomar. The whole caveat to this is Mrs. Johnson's son, Dr. Joseph Johnson, was working for Caltech, and he was responsible for the sky mapping and location of putting the 200-inch telescope up there above George's property. And so a great many of these people came to and fro and visited him and talked to him. And some of the astronomers complained that when they first activated the 200-inch, every time they pointed the ocular somewhere, a large mothership parked in front of the viewfinder. And every time they swiveled it around, it moved around with it. And so George, of course, had some of his famous pictures in 1950 of these crafts, the bell-shaped craft and the cigar-shaped craft. And they were published in the first book called Flying Saucers Have Landed with Sir Desmond Leslie of Castle Leslie and the Irish estate. And there was a great deal of interest from Lord Mountbatten and from Lord Dowden, the Chief Air Marshal. And these were his sponsors when he went in 1959 to the United Kingdom to lecture. So these people had access far above the average citizen, and they were very much in support of these craft and the extraterrestrial visitations. And so George took these pictures, submitted it to the government, submitted it to the military. Basically, he gave them away to anybody who really came up there and asked him for them. And then as the years progressed, he took motion picture footage. And his motion picture footage, of course, from the 50s, shows the incredible acceleration and standstill performance of these crafts. And all different areas around the country, in Wisconsin and in Mexico and in Boston and what have you. And anybody who sees these films knows that there's no way that they can be faked. Absolutely impossible. Pev Marley from the large production company in Hollywood looked at it and said, no way. And of course, the other experts said you can't fake telescopic shots because the graying effect of the ocular is not duplicable. And we didn't have computers and Photoshop and all the other stuff that developed since the late 70s and early 80s, which now, and even then, the technology was so capable that they could pretty much duplicate and fake anything they wanted to, especially today. And so George went on a world tour to New Zealand and Australia, stopping in India and the Middle East, and then up through Europe and the United Kingdom, and brought his films out and described that pretty much in his book, Flying Saucers Farewell, which doesn't mean goodbye, it means fare thee well. And we have re-released that under the new title, the paperback title of the book, originally in the 70s was Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery. And we kept that title and called it Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2, in which we added about 60 new pages of updated information and an entire illustration section that didn't exist in the first book, with letters from people like Frank Edwards, the journalist of Flying Saucer Serious Business, Major Kehoe, Nightcap, all kinds of people that supposedly shunned George but didn't have any problem corresponding with him on the side. And so George's experience stood out. And then, just before the Pope died, Pope John the 23rd, George went to see Queen Juliana and then delivered a sealed message from the space people to the Pope 2 weeks before he passed away. And the church gave him, by order of the Pope, a small gold medallion. And I have that here in our archives. I travel around with my briefcase with all the original pictures in there and the gold medallion and a whole lot of other information. I would say that one briefcase has more information than most libraries or archives. So George was the most unique individual, I would say, in this field. He didn't exploit it. He never changed his story. And he stayed true to the mission that he was given. He took Eisenhower out into the desert and escorted him to one of these crafts that landed on the tarmac. And Lord Clancarty was, in fact, responsible for breaking that story. And then he also did the same for John Kennedy in 1962, along with his brother, the Attorney General, in a different air base out here in California. And George had a White House access card, and he showed it to us. And that gets him in to whenever they requested him to come there and do a briefing. And he would stay at the Willard Hotel, which is right practically across the street from the White House and the underground entrances into there that are used for everything other than the public stuff that goes to the front door. So I will say that they ostracize and they try to negate George the most because he had the most evidence and the most to say, the most concrete of all the UFO people that I can think of to this day. And he didn't deal in mysticism. He didn't deal in psychism. He didn't deal in sensationalism. He dealt with, dare one say, down to earth association and relationship to this field. And I can't think of anyone that could possibly compare to him.
Have you got a personal anecdote you could share about when you first met George, or a memory you had of George? Because I think you were probably quite young when you met him, right?
I was, but absolutely. I was 6 years old. And so George would say to me, and one has to understand that these photographs and films aren't just haphazard. It's not like today where everybody runs around with their cell phone camera taking pictures of everything, so much so that they don't live their lives. They are vicarious through the machine. And so in those days, you walked around with an 8 or 16 millimeter camera. That was the novelty. And so in order to get the quality material that George got, it had to be arranged, plain and simple. And they would come. I remember in Silver Springs, he said to me, Glenn, a couple of space visitors are coming, and they're going to sit here on the table, and we are all going to sit on this table, and there will be discussion. Keep your mouth closed and your ears open. And since my parents had already raised me that way to begin with, it was no big deal. And so in came these two young fellows. They sat at the dining room table, and they began to discuss the schedules and what they were going to, how the ship was going to come and when to be ready and all of this. And that happened throughout George's entire career in this. And so, yes, I remember that quite vividly. I remember that the intelligence community had a car parked down at the end of the driveway. And my father would say, let's go down there, Glenn, and give them a thermos of coffee because it's a long night and what have you. And so we went down there, and it's a cul-de-sac. They were surrounded by trees. There's no other houses there. And he tapped on the window, and these two guys just about jumped through the roof. And they weren't expecting anything. And so he gave them the coffee, and he talked to them. And my father was always a friendly with the officials. He didn't believe in accusing them. You catch more, flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And so he said, you can tell your bosses that I'm very happy that you guys are here for two reasons. One, you wouldn't be wasting your time if you didn't think there was something of value to be watching. And secondly, I'm happy to contribute to the economy and employment of the United States government so that there's more of you fellows. And so about a week later, he had talked to one of his space friends, and in my father's book, Why Are They Here? Spaceships from Other Worlds, my father describes his meeting with the space people and the space people that was introduced through George as well, and we knew for many years. And so he made an arrangement, and he said a week later, he took my hand and said, let's go down the driveway. It was about 9 at night, pitch black, clear skies, no clouds, star field. And down there was parked the car with the two agents in it. We walked down the driveway, and he turned into the cul-de-sac, which is like a round circle. And he took his flashlight, and he flashed a series of coded flashes. And within about 5 seconds, the entire street lit up like a giant spotlight from space, flashing back the exact same code. And these two guys in the car, they started that engine and stomped on there and peeled rubber until they got out of there, and they never came back. We had a new set of agents the next day.
Wow.
So, yeah, I remember all kinds of little things like this.
I'd love to hear about any of your other contacts.
I would say that my parents, and obviously, with me along, and they never hid anything. Everything, and with George as well, they treated me like an adult. They explained it. This was going to happen, or why this was going to happen, or what you may see. The ship's going to come and it's going to fly over, and you will see this, and what have you. And so it was not as much as a novelty as some might think. After a while, you come well to accept the reality of it. And so some of the space people continued this relationship. And I remember once my father asked them, because they helped him, they specifically came to him where he worked at night in his office and helped him compose his book, Why Are They Here? And so he asked them, this is an aggressive planet, and we are very unpredictable and volatile people. We can't really be trusted to say or do what we claim to because we change our minds instantaneously based on selfishness and ego and all kinds of other traits. So he said, since they will not take a life to defend themselves, they'd never get themselves in a position where that becomes an issue. First of all, the man explained that with the ability to read thoughts, we can already tell if there is an incident that is happening or about to happen. If somebody holds a thought across the street that I'm going to rob this house, you're already forewarned because you can read that thought. And secondly, they carry a little device, which is also on their ships as well. And this device that they carry on their person, about the size of a cigarette lighter, is bending light rays around the object that it is around. So in other words, they activate the device and the light rays bend around it. And since you only see what is reflected back in through your eyes into your brain, because in reality your brain sees, not your eyes, then the light rays continue around the object, and so you can no longer see it. Physically, There's no such thing as dimensional shifting or time warp or all this other science fiction nonsense. What it is physically they're still there. You can touch them, you can hear them, and they can walk right past you. And so my father says, I'd love to see that in action. And so a few weeks later, we're walking along the street of Washington, D.C., and this gentleman, the same guy, is walking towards us, and in his arms he has his hamper of laundry. And as he gets close, within a couple meters, all of a sudden he lifts his hand and waves and disappears. Gone he is. And you can hear him walking right past us, the sound of his shoes. And we all three of us turn around and look, and a couple meters behind us, he suddenly reappears and turns around and waves again and smiles and keeps walking.
Wow.
So, and so let us at least be clear on one thing. They're not coming here to entertain us. They're not coming here to fix our problems. They're more than happy to help us and help us have information to make wise decisions to fix our own problems, because they firmly know and believe that what you create, you then are responsible for, and you will never learn how to take care of it if somebody else constantly fixes it for you. Not any different than raising your children. You got to learn by experience, and sometimes that experience isn't very pleasant, but that is a necessity. And so they're not coming here to save us or to some new age of Aquarius kind of thing where some malevolent force is supposed to force us into this new state of awareness and being. That is completely against natural law, because every individual on this planet is at a different stage of learning and development. And you cannot shove that person from one school of thought into the next one and expect them to comprehend it and know what to do. Nature provides that guidance and not some kind of other thing. So there is so much misinformation that is circulated here, because the people on this world don't want to be responsible for what they do. If they don't feel good, it's the ET's fault. If they've got psychological problem, it's the ET's fault. If they've got some kind of physical illness, then the ET's abducted them and their fault. We are constantly deferring responsibility away from ourselves, and this is our most destructive characteristic, that and ignorance, which is tied to it.
You're very suspicious of the traditional alien abduction narrative, which has become such a part of the UFO belief system. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your take on that?
Well, one of my new book is called The Hoax of Alien Abductions. And one of the best books that I can recommend people to read comes from an author by the name of Susan Clancy. And it's a book called Abducted: How People Come to Believe They Were Kidnapped by Aliens. And it is put out by Harvard University Press. And it is fantastic at helping to explain how these issues are replicated throughout the population due to some common misconceptions and common, shall we say, illnesses and discrepancies in mental health and what have you. And so my emphasis on this is alien abductions. I'm not saying that there are people who go out and try to scare the living dickens out of people, and the intelligence community and their agents have been actively involved in this in some cases. But nobody travels across tens of thousands and millions of miles of space and has that technology, because that technology is 4,000 years about ahead of us. And to infer that you can be 4,000 years ahead of us technologically and still be caveman in our characteristics and the type of bizarre things that we do to one another, this comes from Earthman. This doesn't come from Spaceman. And so I am vehemently in the debate concerning that. Because just because people say it doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, look how many people thought the Earth was flat and still think it, and it's not true. Or the Earth is hollow, or it was the devil that killed everybody in the Black Plague and not bacteria and virus. I do not support that at all. And of course, that causes a lot of heartburn in the UFO community, because that is one of their major contentions. they're using this as a fear factor. And if you look at it closely, it's the very same fear factor that governments and agencies have promoted since 1961. 61 was the test case, and after that, the whole UFO thing went divergent in that direction. And everybody is now scared out of their minds. And of course, science fiction and the movie industry and the media have hyped on that and used that. And in fact, if you look at the book Hollywood versus the Alien or Silver Screen Saucer, either one of those books are absolutely wonderful at explaining how Hollywood and the media has been used by the government. In fact, the government has their own office right across the street from the major production companies, and all these sci-fi scripts have to be approved beforehand. And so there is a very definite agenda of scaring the population of this planet. So one, you will not approach one of these crafts if it lands. You will either run for your life in fear or you will attack it. And that's exactly what those who govern this world want. Because the extraterrestrials represent the quintessential threat to them. Not physical, not mental. The threat is the change that will be coming about in this world if it is accepted. And that is considered to be the biggest problem. We are running not so much an oil economy anymore, although it's a prevalent part of it. We're running a military industrialization economy. And that requires, like my dear old dad used to say, no breakage, no makeage. So instigated conflicts have to be constantly aggravated in order to run our markets and our economy. And so this is how we have chosen to conduct policy on this planet. And if somebody comes here from somewhere else, the first thing is the people say, well, how do you live? And what have you learned? And what is it that you have that we can partake of? And that changes everything. As I mentioned in the book, when we went to Mexico, George had advised us where there was a landing base. And so in '69, we bought a property very close to that area at the base of the mountain. And we moved in. We had a ranch, a working ranch. And a week after we arrived, the military police showed up in 2 huge truckloads. And the commandant came and knocked on the door. My father said, hello, how you doing? Come on in. And the rest of the troops dispersed all over the properties with magnetometers and rods that go in the ground and little radar devices, whatever all the technology they had available. And they became to scan the whole property, 40-some acres of it. And so my father and the commandant stood there in the living room, and we were sitting there on the table. And my dad said to them, he says, this gives me great joy because obviously you wouldn't come here looking for something if you didn't believe there was something to find to begin with. And so the commandant just laughed, and my father said, don't worry, you're not going to find a spaceship because if I had one of those, I'd gotten the hell out of here a long time ago. And so I think the commandant probably thought to himself, me too. And so he pointed to George's picture hanging on the wall. He says, we've received a small dossier from the Pentagon telling us about you and your activities and so on and so forth. He pointed to the picture and he said, clear as day, we know they are here. We know where they come from. We know they are good for us, but we don't want them. And my father looked at him and said, well, I find that incredible because if something's good for you, why don't you want it? He says, because it addresses the very fabrics of our tradition, our religion, our economic and political structure, and we don't want it. Now, you got to remember that Mexico, of course, only one of the many countries that have numerous UFO sightings and landings. 3 students that were camping out there in the 50s out at the pyramids of Mexico where a saucer landed, and they were taken on board and flown around the moons of Saturn. And then there was a printed article of one of the space people who approached one of the farmers and showed him how to grow produce that was 10 times the size and 10 times the nutritional value. And the farmer approached the government and said, look here, look what they showed me, and this is how it's done. And they didn't want anything to do with it. They'd rather have people starve than admit to that. And that's the kind of mentality that is going on.
You're also a commercial airline pilot, right?
That's correct.
Can you tell me about any UFO sightings that you have seen while flying?
Sure. I've seen several. I remember once we were traveling to Europe, and the so called lanes or freeways in the sky, what we call the track system, that changes twice a day across the North Atlantic because everybody from the U.S. is going to Europe at night, getting there in the morning, and then everybody in Europe is leaving in the morning and traveling during the day back to the U.S., so they get at a reasonable time there. And one of the northern tracks took us up towards Goose Bay and ellipsed across central Greenland. At that night, probably, I guess, 2 in the morning, somewhere around there, we looked at I would say about a little bit between a crescent and half moon. And from behind it came this immense object pulsating and slowly looped in front of the moon and then passed out into space. We all sat there and looked at it, and the other two didn't say anything, and I wasn't going to press the issue. And so that was one sighting. Another one is I was flying a route down to Buenos Aires, and the route takes you over Bogota and Quito, and then along the eastern fringe of the Andes Mountain, and that borders along the Amazon jungle. And there are areas where you literally fly for a couple hours, and there's not a light to be seen, not a speck anywhere below you. And one evening I watched in a kind of an octagonal, luminescent, pulsating object, very much like the two that were photographed by the Gemini capsule. And they come out of the area of the jungle and then come out and then slowly drift up and then kind of hold motionless and then suddenly rapidly accelerate and shoot out into space. And I had a good friend of mine. In fact, he was Australian, and he, many, many years ago, used to work the oil fields off the coast of Perth and fly a helicopter back and forth. And he once saw me working on my father's book when I did the revision in the 90s. And I don't advertise what I do. My interests or my hobbies or my extracurricular activities are not associated to my company or profession or anything like that, because I like to keep my job. I still got a few years before I retire, and that's a necessity. So I was working in there and sitting in a restaurant across the street doing it, and he came over and sat down. He said, "What you looking at?" So I showed him, and he thumbed through the pictures, and he said, he was one evening traveling from the oil platform back to the western coast of Australia with some oil executives on board. And he said, it was about just a little bit before twilight. And he said, out of the ocean came an immense whitish light, and the water started to boil almost. And then out of the ocean rose the cigar-shaped ship exactly as photographed by George Adamski. And he said it must have been several thousand feet long, and slowly came out of the ocean and hovered, and then tilted up on its axis and accelerated straight up into space. Says something he'll never forget. So there's a multitude of astronauts who have talked, not all of them, but we all know Gordon Cooper, and we know Edgar Mitchell, and many of the other ones. If you look at Maurice Chatelain's book, Our Ancestors Came from Outer Space, he is the patent holder and the telecommunications for NASA during the space program, and he chronology lists all the space flights and tells exactly all the UFOs they encountered. Even had music piped into the capsule. And so you've got pilots, you've got commercial pilots, military pilots. I'm sure your listener are familiar with the JAL crews over Alaska, the 747 crew that also encountered a cigar-shaped craft and the government tried desperately to silence them, but they came from a foreign country, and there was nothing that we could do. I mean, we do exert an immense amount of influence now in silencing other countries. When we talk about all the releases from France and from England, And these files that are supposedly coming out, these files are very carefully screened. They're not going to let anything out that embarrasses them or gives too much information. And we dictate the policy for all of that because we hold the purse strings.
What do your fellow pilots tend to think about UFOs?
I'm not going to say that there's a huge gathering of, kumbaya people who are just, saying me, but you have to understand that in my profession, first of all, nobody wants to be ostracized. And secondly, there are all kinds of deterrents when you go public with this stuff. The same thing as the air traffic controllers. Air traffic controllers, if they reported these sightings, they were called right away, put on leave. They were called in for psychological evaluations. In the early days, they were told to just plainly shut up. Just like the astronauts, you have some of them that are willing to say something, that believe that the information and the progress that it brings is vital. A lot of people see something and they don't know. There was this one incident I remember not too long ago in which something was seen over the southwestern United States, in which several of the pilots called into air traffic control and said, hey, do you have an object at this position on your radar? Because we have something that's called a TCAS, or Traffic Collision Alert System, and so that allows us to see the other objects as long as they're broadcasting a particular code and beacon as well. And so if you just get a plain radar sweep of it, it doesn't give you all the information as altitude and speed and direction and things like that. And so a couple different carriers, pilots from different carriers called in and say, hey, I see this thing. And the other guy says, yeah, I see it too. So there's a bit of an acceptance. And then, of course, just like anything else, a bit of skepticism, a bit of ridicule. And so I think it's an individual thing. I mean, person sees something, it's up to them whether they decide to speak out about it or just let it be. And a lot of times, people just decide to let it be because we are concerned with our basic sustenance and our home and mortgage payments and, our wives and children and things like that. And nobody likes to be ostracized from the community or from their little groups or their picnics and what have you. So, like I said, it's like anything else. Some do and some don't.
Glenn, I'm very interested in the spiritual aspect of the UFO phenomenon. Can you talk a little about, I guess, any theosophical or spiritual influences on Adamski, or maybe on his approach to his contact with extraterrestrials?
Well, let us first recognize that George was their representative. So he was the vehicle for information to flow. He wasn't the only one. And when you look at things, the history of this subject, it is being so, shall we say, the attempt to rewrite the UFO history and corrupt the UFO history is a very serious battle that's going on. And so George brought forth the information as it was given to him. And so he wrote the telepathy series as it was given to him, which shows people what telepathy really means, not this fantasized form that is running around in the New Age world. But it is a picture language. It requires no vocal language if you are able to pick up the thoughts. And it is used by every sentient being in the cosmos. Your animals do it with you. You do it with them. Nature does it with you as well. Kirlian photography has proven that the plants are intelligent and have cognizance. And so when they ran their experiments of having a plant in one room that somebody went in there and tore apart, and then that same person went into a room with the other plants, they had all registered very high in the frequency and the power range. So they recognized what that means. And so telepathy allows us to communicate through picture language, no matter what the distance. So let's say I would know somebody who is on another planet. And by picturing that person, they instantaneously, because there's no time or distance, pick up the fact that I'm picturing them. Now, if bring it a little bit closer to home and say, okay, I have a friend in Russia, and I picture that person, and I picture the phone. They receive my picture of me, and they receive the phone, and they say, well, let's call Glenn, because he's thinking and telling me to call him. And that's basically how this works. It does not work in language, because you can say phone in Russian and it doesn't mean diddly to somebody who doesn't understand the language. And so this is not used. Planets do have a universal language, a central language that is available. But as you go in higher development, they're using telepathy. And that doesn't mean they don't speak. They just prefer to communicate that way. Thus, when you have an open mind and an open consciousness, there are no secrets. And this alone makes people of this world highly uncomfortable, because we all have our little secrets that we hide, the little white lies, the little thoughts, the little behaviorisms that we don't want anybody to know, and so on and so forth. And so, as George said, most people who would go to another world like this, that is higher developed, wouldn't like it there for very long, because it's not them. They haven't reached that point of development where they are now part of that society. So telepathy course I always recommend to everybody. Then George wrote Cosmic Philosophy, and then he wrote the 12-part series, The Science of Life. And one of the interesting caveats to that, in one of the chapters, he talks about that Mars has a large contingent of salt water. Well, guess what? A few years ago, we have admitted that there is salt water on Mars. So George continues to be correct, no matter what the age and what the decade or the situation. But the Science of Life is a great self-awareness course. And there's a whole plethora of other writings that I have here in archives that are not necessarily all published. They are meant to be given in a different venue out. One of them is Face to Face with Self, which my father took very dear to his heart in order to make the developments he needed to make. And Who Lives in This House of Clay, and the Principles of Reincarnation, which exist whether we like it or not. And it doesn't exist between humans and animals and vice versa, because it's an entirely different frequency. You stay within the frequency range of what you are constructed. So I listened the other night to a program where the guy says, well, I had 80 past lives, and I remember 60 of them were animals, and this and this. And all I could say, well, what a bunch of nonsense. And so I think that from the philosophical standpoint, to learn what they have learned in their many thousands of years of travel and exposure, these are good steps and foundations in order to understand that. And I recommend that to anybody who is interested in that development. And some of the basic principles have already been taught. I mean, if you look at some of the basic principles of Confucius and Buddha and Jesus and Moses, the core half a dozen principles are always the same. And yet they're the most simplest. And we still can't put them into practice. And simply because when it's inconvenient for us personally, we always trade principle away. Now, I remember one of the intelligence agents offered my father $1 million. In those days, that was big money. In any account, in any country, tax-free, if he would betray George and his space contacts. My father didn't even hesitate. He said, you know what, you can kiss my hide. But how many people have that principle? Today, the UFO community is what about what? Give me more airtime. Give me more show time. Listen to what I have to say. You know, it's just, watch it on television. Ancient Aliens. It's this constant self-promotion. And they really don't have any answers. They always say, well, ancient alien theorists agree. Of course they're going to agree. They don't know what the heck they're talking about. So they sure as heck, they're not going to stand out amongst each other. So when you listen to it, well, it could be this or it could be that, or or this or this or that, or definitively, well, absolutely, it's alien influence. They haven't a clue. Not a clue.
That's interesting too, because, and I'm not going to talk about this with you now because I'll run out of time, but it's fascinating because in many ways, it's in Adamski's first book. It's the Desmond Leslie section of that, which really almost introduces ancient astronaut theory. It does predate von Daniken, really.
It does. It does predate him, sure.
We've got to have you on again, Glenn, because I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple more questions. I could talk to you forever. Now I hit the part. No, I'm serious. Now I hit the part of the show where when I'm with somebody I'm really interested in, I'm essentially just asking questions for myself more than for the audience.
Well, go ahead, shoot, ask whatever you want. I'm an open book for the best that I can, and if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. And like I said, I'm more than happy to do more programs with you anytime you wish.
Thank you so much. There was an Englishman named Arthur Bryant who allegedly had contact with 3 extraterrestrials from Venus shortly after Adamski's death, and one of them identified as Yamski, which seemed to be, or so the story implied, a reincarnated George Adamski. I'd love to know what your take is on that story.
That's absolutely incorrect. That's nothing but a propaganda ploy. Absolutely incorrect. There were many impersonators of George that would go out and speak in public and say absolutely the opposite and cause a great deal of confusion. And George was able to stay ahead of the game because his public venues, of course, there were a multitude of witnesses. And when somebody says you're in Milwaukee and you're sitting in Washington, D.C., then you're talking in front of the Air Force Reserve, then it's kind of difficult to make that stick. And so there were many imposters that tried to confuse that issue. In fact, one of the biggest one was Valiant Thor. In the fall of 1965, Valiant Thor comes and knocks on our door. And my dad and I are standing there looking at him, and my dad starts laughing. I mean, he literally starts laughing. He says, I know who you are. You're sure as hell no extraterrestrial. You're a misinformation agent for the Pentagon. And Thor started laughing. He said, yeah, that is true. And so my father says, well, you're not going to get any traction here. And so you really aren't welcome. So, have a nice day. And he said goodbye, and off he went. And these were just some of the individuals that were engaged in this type of activity. The Yamski thing was the same thing. This was all in an attempt to create or sow confusion, not only amongst the people, but also amongst some of the co-workers in foreign countries that were not so much in the communication loop as we are today. You either pick up a phone and spend a fortune, or you send a letter. And that takes several weeks. It's not instantaneous as we are now. And so there were several of those circumstances.
Huh. I'm not sure if you're aware of Alan Greenfield's book, Secret Cipher of the UFO-Nauts, but either way, I'm going to ask you the question. The book, I guess, proposes, as the title itself suggests, that there's some kind of occult, numerological, or Kabbalah-style cipher that's used by UFO entities to convey messages based upon such things as the names that they go by and the planets that they say that they come from and the like. For example, in that book, I think Orthon, he says, equals the number 132, which equals prey, meaning predator prey, not prey as in praying, but prey of the gods. I don't know if you have any take on Greenfield's secret cipher or on that idea at all.
Nonsense. First of all, the name Orthon and the other names were not these people's names to begin with. These were names that were symbolically George gave them. Orthon means the noble one. And then there are other the other names that he gave them have other descriptions as well. So this is once again part of the misinformation genre that is there in order to confuse this whole subject, mix it all up so nobody knows up from down or right from left. And so, first of all, there's no such thing as channeling. When these people channel, they're talking to themselves, their own mind, because nobody comes through your body. That would never be done by an extraterrestrial. Never. And they couldn't do it to begin with. Secondly, they want to communicate with you. They come to you. They know how basic and, shall we say, primeval we are. When they come to us and stand in front of us and talk to us, they know already that conversation has a high likelihood of getting screwed up. I mean, how many times has somebody told you something and you've told it to a friend of yours, and by the time it gets to the fifth person, it's completely different from what the original story was? So when they know our frailties, so when they want to communicate, they come to you. And George, like I said, wasn't the only contact. There were twin sisters in Norway. There was a lady in South Africa and many other places where these craft land and they communicate. But if you run like hell and you're scared, obviously you're not going to get a very good venue of communication. And so when they come, they discuss it with you. And if you're receptive, you will gain some knowledge and you will gain some enlightenment from it. And if you're not receptive, then they decide now is not the right time and they go to the next place. First of all, we're not the only speck of enlightenment in the cosmos. We're just a little grain of sand. And they've got a purpose to their being and existence as well. And that's not just to come and pull us out of the garbage all the time. And so, I mean, the fact that they continue to come here for thousands of years to be of assistance is already gracious beyond description. I mean, that's truly putting into practice being your brother's keeper that we give so much lip service to. And so I think that we need to give that a little credit. I mean, that is gone now. Who talks about that now in the UFO field?
Mm-hmm.
Who? They're not interested in that at all. The moment I tell an audience, guess what? You're responsible for your behavior and the consequences of your actions, and you have to want to change it. You got to get busy with yourself. Boy, it's like turning off a light switch. They don't want to hear that. Too bad. I still tell them. That's why they don't invite me anymore. That's why they don't invite me anymore. But you know what? I can live with that.
I have one more question, and I know Jen wants to ask you something quite pertinent. It dates back to that 99 research trip where I got to meet you, and I also got to sit down with Jim Moseley. And I know there was some contention with Jim Moseley and his approach to Adamski, but when I was chatting with him in Clearwater, Florida, he actually talked a little bit about the so-called Straith letter. And according to Jim, I think it was him and Gray Barker had snagged some official State Department stationery, maybe from one of their brother-in-laws or something. And he said that they'd hoaxed that letter to Adamski, which pretty much said something along the lines of, while the US government couldn't come out and publicly confirm his encounters, that people in the government supported him behind the scenes. I'd love to hear your take on this story.
Absolutely. First of all, I ran into Jim in 92 giving a lecture with Madeline Rotifer in Trenton, New Jersey. And Jim and I sat in a little foyer off to the side. This is also in my book. And we kind of eyed each other until finally I said to Jim, I know you know better, and you know I know you know better. So why do you continue this charade? And he laughed and he said, he admitted to having seen some of these UFOs. He said, but I will never admit it in public. I will tell the people that they're either apparitions or ghosts or whatever. So Jim played a double standard in order to satiate his backers. First of all, the Straith letter is much more than just the stamped State Department. And this letter has been dissected already by Flying Saucer Review and found out it's not fake. And when they say that there's no such thing as the Cultural Exchange Committee, well, in the book Behind the Saucer Flying Mystery, too, we did extensive research in the newspaper archives and found an article that mentions the State Department's Cultural Exchange Committee. And in fact, Bob Hope used it when his travels across into the Eastern Bloc. And so Moseley and Barker made that claim because they knew that nobody was going to challenge them on it. So, as you well know, it is a federal crime to fake a government correspondence, letters, stamps, everything. These boys are going to risk going to federal prison? I don't think so. So the whole story, their house of cards, totally came crumbling down. And I said, Jim, one of the things that gives me the greatest pleasure is the fact that I'm going to outlive all of you. I'm going to have the final say long after you're gone, and you won't be able to say a word against it. So I believe totally on the authenticity of the Straith letter, and also the examination that was done on the letter, and also the witnesses to the Straith letter, and to the revelation that everything they claimed that didn't exist actually did exist. So there's no way that Mosley and Barker's story hold up. No way. Everybody knows Mosley was basically a paid disinformation junkie. That was his job.
I actually didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think Saucer Smear was? He didn't do that out of the goodness out of his heart. He was supported in promoting that.
What direction do you see the future of UFO research going in? Are you optimistic?
Well, on a whole, no. But optimism is something that we should always hold dear because it gives a chance. And life always provides chances. And nature is not discriminatory. Creation is not discriminatory. And so it continues to provide chances for us to be able to come to the state of awareness where we're supposed to be. It's like disclosure. Disclosure is nothing but a fantasy because there's no way that the government, the military, and the forces that control them are going to spend half a century or more to negate this subject, only to turn around and say, oh, so sorry, Charlie, we're going to tell you the truth now. That's never going to happen. And if you think about it, it would never go over well either, because if they release the truth, the UFO community is going to be the largest dissenter, because it's not going to match what they have been promoting for all this time. So they're going to be really upset about it. And secondly, they're going to tell everybody, well, you couldn't trust them before, so you can't trust them now, so they're really lying to you. So don't believe them, believe us. So disclosure is a myth. The only way we will ever admit to extraterrestrial life is if it comes here in mass sightings, and it already has. As I say in the book, and actually Roberto Panotte there with his UFOs over Italy, and he's the organizer of the San Marino Conference. I mean, through the 50s, there were waves of UFOs flying over 52, the nation's capital in the U.S., 54, London in the UK, also over France, also over Rome, and over Vatican, a dozen of them, photographed over the Vatican. And this has multiplied across every major capital and every major country on the face of this planet. I mean, what more else can they do, for God's sake? You know, and so if we leave it up to those who are in the field now, no, I don't have a great deal of hope, because they have a vested interest in making sure that it stays confused. On the other side of that, I would say that they're still the natural scientists. There are still officials that wish information to come out, like when my father went to NASA and went to the Pentagon with Colonel Freeman. He's looked at George's films and he said, these are some of the best I've seen in civilian hands. And then he said to my father, what do you know about the saucer we're supposed to have at Dayton? And my father said, what about it? and he said, and then Freeman just smiled and didn't say anything. And the rest of the staff sat there. And so there's still that avenue of information that will drift out. Now it comes down to how smart are the people to see it, right? And that percentage is going to be small as compared to those who don't want to go there. They want to believe in something else. I told somebody the other day, I said, let's look at your concept of astrology. I said, first of all, the Earth is moving at thousands of miles an hour. then the sun is moving at what, 600, 700,000 miles an hour. Then the solar system is moving around in space at millions of miles an hour. All of creation is in motion. And the light that you look into the sky and see now was generated millions of years ago when that object was in a completely different location. And you're going to determine your life and your destiny based upon a pinprick of light that isn't even stationary? And they didn't like that conversation because it's reality, and we don't like reality on this world. So I'm hopeful, but, I'm cautious.
I'm equally suspicious of the disclosure narrative. It reminds me of a song from a musical. Disclosure, disclosure, I love you. Disclosure, you're only a day away. It's been coming forever, and it never gets here. All of that said, I can't wait to read your upcoming book, Glenn. When you have that out, I want to read a copy as soon as it comes out and have you back on the show.
I will send you an autographed copy to both of you, and then we'll do the show again. And as I said, I'm always very happy to interact with the people. And obviously, I'm a little bit different from the rest of the bears in the woods, but, we all get along and do the best we can. So I'm here to do that for the remainder time that I'm spending on this world as well. And hopefully it finds, a receptive audience. And occasionally I do. When I go to a lecture, there's only about maybe 10% of the audience that actually connects. But if it's only one person, that domino effect can do fantastic things. And if it helps anybody to realize more about their potential and our place in the cosmos, then I've done the very best I can.
Well, it was a pleasure having you on the show. You were a gentleman to me back in 99, and you're still a gentleman. Thank you, Glenn.
Well, thank you both very much, and I look forward to doing it again.
I always enjoy chatting to Glenn Steckling. While regular listeners of the show have probably realized by now that my personal views on the UFO phenomenon are closer to those expressed by John Keel, Jacques Vallée, and the like, it's so interesting today to hear an extraterrestrial hypothesis that diverges from the modern, well-worn X-Files type narrative. Glenn's upcoming book, The UFO Reality, Can Truth Prevail?, will be available later this year. In the meantime, you can visit the George Adamski Foundation's official website at adamskifoundation.com. At that site, you can order earlier books and other materials by George Adamski, Glenn Steckling, and Glenn's father, Fred. Find Glenn on Facebook at george.adamski Foundation. Of course, you can always find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review. Jen and I would really appreciate it. Next week, we welcome John and Amy Bullard, as well as Sabrina Ross, to talk about their intriguing paranormal investigation of the so-called Mississippi House, as covered in the brand new feature film documentary, The House in Between. Until then, my friends, keep it weird.